everyone, I am Chef JLCE, and today we're going to be going over some common kitchen mistakes. So one of the first things that I always see as a common mistake that a lot of home cooks tend to make is that they often get confused about which measurement they need to be using. So right here I have a liquid measure and I have a solid measure. Now what it is that there's a difference between weight versus volume. So as defined, weight is simply just measuring the heaviness of a substance. Volume is the space occupied by a substance. So whenever we're using weight is usually grams, ounces, pounds. And sometimes when we're measuring with weight, we tend to use a scale. When we're working with volume, we're talking about teaspoons, cups, liters, gallons, all those sort of things. And using those utensils are measuring the space that it takes up. Since we can't take water by itself in its liquid state and measure it by weight, we use volume, something like this. Since flour is a solid substance, this can be measured more accurately by its weight. And sometimes we use this. Now this would technically be considered volume, a volume weight. And I know that sometimes on my channel, sometimes in my classes, because we use these cups interchangeably to weigh our dry ingredients, sometimes it can be a little skewed. So let me explain. Whenever we're working with grams, ounces, pounds, we typically should use a form of a scale or something like that to measure these ingredients accurately. For instance, if I had a digital scale right here in front of me, I would simply get a bowl or something like that, level it out, and then I would begin to measure my dry ingredients. Now, when I'm working with liquids of any kind, this is what I would use. This would be my go-to, because I'm simply just measuring the volume of that thing, whereas weight is literally just the heaviness of it. Now, we use these interchangeably sometimes, but it's important to know that cups measure volume as well. They tend to measure volume as well, and so it's important to know, especially if you're going to be baking, that you know the difference between weight and volume. And so if you decide to use a measuring cup like this to measure your dry ingredients, it's not a bad thing, but just know for accuracy, you should always try to keep a scale or a digital scale around you at times, if you can, if you desire to, because it may help in the long run with the overall outcome of the meal. That is the biggest difference. That is one of the common mistakes I see a lot of people in their home kitchens make, and sometimes we make those mistakes too in the kitchen, but it's important to know that difference. One of the next common mistakes I see a lot of home cooks make is they don't know the difference between butter and margarine. Now, I have a stick of butter right here, some good old Blue Bonnet. I do not use margarine like that, but I have butter right now on me. And so the difference really quick that you need to understand is that butter is made with a cream, usually a Dairy Queen, usually a dairy cream like milk or heavy whipping cream or anything like that, while margarine is made out of oil, soybean oils, corn oil, and things like that. Now, I am not a doctor, so I'm not going to tell you which one to use in your kitchen for a healthier experience. That's not my job today. My job is just to tell you the difference. So when you go in the kitchen, you make sure that you are using the right stuff. People usually tend to lean towards margarine because margarine is quote-unquote healthier for you, although according to Harvard studies, there is no real link between margarine or butter, one being healthier than the other. So whenever you're baking, especially, because most of the time when we're cooking like on the stove top or something like that, butter and margarine really doesn't have a difference in the role that it plays when you're cooking on the stove top or you're preparing some type of savory dish. Usually the difference is shown primarily when you're baking. So when you're baking, it's important to know the difference, because butter will add the richness, the flavor, and the texture that a baked good needs in order to make it really good. But margarine, on the other hand, it can work somehow, but it will result in a depleted flavor, less richness, less texture, and it can also cause an unwarranted spread or texture that you don't desire in your baked good. So it's always important to make sure that whenever you're working with the type of fat or anything like that, that you are using the right kind. Don't make the mistake, especially if you're baking, to use butter or margarine unbeknownst to you the difference between the two. One of the common mistakes that I see a lot of home cooks deal with is that they don't properly understand how to use a roux, and they need to know the difference. First of all, let's be very clear. There are three kinds of roux. There is white roux, blonde roux, and brown roux. Now, the longer a roux cooks, the darker it gets, thus the three levels. And also, it's important to know that the longer that a roux cooks, not only does it get darker, but it also loses its thickening ability. In other words, if my sauce, if I was making a pan gravy right here, and I wanted it to be a brown color, I let that roux cook for a long time until it produces this kind of nutty aroma. Once that happens, I now have to understand that in that moment, those the granulates of starch have been completely cooked out of that flour. And now, in order to make my gravy thicker, that means that I would have to produce a more brown roux. I'm going to show you how to make all three. Now, it's important to understand that a roux is a form of a thickening agent, usually used in sauces and such like that. Now, the most quickest roux you can have is a white roux. That roux has probably only cooked for about a minute or two. Blonde will cook for about 3, maybe 4 minutes, and of course, brown roux will have cooked its longest time, probably like 6 or 7 minutes it has cooked. And it's important to know that when a roux is at its lightest, it is also at its thickest. Like I mentioned before, once that roux begins to cook down and become brown and everything like that, that now opens up the door for that roux to lose its thickness. Once it loses its thickness, now more roux would have to be produced in that same fashion in order to produce the thickness that you desire. So it's important to know whenever you're making any kind of sauce to be mindful of the roux and what happens when a roux is made. So I'm going to show you really quick how to make a roux. So right in my hand, I showed you that blue bonnet earlier. I have about 2 tablespoons of blue bonnet. That is going to be my fat, because a roux is equal parts fat and equal parts flour by weight. So this means that if I'm going to be using a roux, I need to make sure that my butter or whatever fat, it could be oil, it could be anything like that, I need to make sure that when I'm making a roux that both of these things are the same measurement. So if I have 2 tablespoons of fat right here in here, I'm going to wait till that melts down, because then once this melts, I'm going to add in equal parts 2 tablespoons of my flour. Now, I haven't seen it used so far, but there's this misconception that somehow cornstarch can be used in the same fashion as a flour can in making a roux. I'm going to turn this down. People tend to have this misconception that, you know, you can make a roux out of cornstarch. You can, but cornstarch, keep in mind, is a pure form of starch. And when it is mixed in there, we usually call it a slurry at times, but when you're using it to try and make a roux out of it, in this sense that I'm doing right now, in the regular roux making process, you can end up with a glossy texture, and it can be undesirable for some, and it just wouldn't even come out right. And Yeah, so don't make the mistake of using cornstarch necessarily as the replacement for flour when making a roux in this fashion. So this is done right here. I want to turn this heat up a little bit, and I'm going to add in my 2 tablespoons of flour. Now, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be labeled. I'm using a regular, like, eating tablespoon. You know, just don't go overboard with it. Just 2 tablespoons. Now, again, while this is cooking, we're going to stir this up like this. And what happens when you're making a roux, you're creating a paste. And that paste, when combined with the other liquid that you're going to use, is what creates the thickness. Now, this right here is a blonde roux. Or, excuse me, this is a white roux. Now, if I let this keep cooking, it's going to get a little bit darker. And the longer that this cooks, it's going to become brown. And as it becomes brown, it's going to illuminate a nutty aroma it will develop. And in that nutty aroma is where I can produce the best base for gravy. But again, you have to be mindful that that gravy won't be as thick if I'm just using that darker roux, because at this stage it is its most thickest. And the reason for that is when you're making the roux, when you begin to make the roux is going through this process where the starch and the fat from that butter is coming together to form something. And so when it's at its peak, which is this white to blonde roux right here, when it's at its peak, it will be the most thickest. Now, as this cooks, again, because the starch and the fat are coming together, it will begin to cook and it will begin to stop that thickening in it, so to speak. And you will have to incorporate more roux into it. You have to make another roux. Sometimes roux can be cooked ahead, and when roux is cooked ahead, you can set it aside and use it later. But sometimes if you're not really the type to use a thickener that much, you can just make it on the fly. Now, I've let this go for about 3 minutes, so I'm just going to leave this here. And as it begins to cook longer, it's going to get darker. So I'm not sure if the camera can pick it up or not. I apologize for that. But as you can see, it's starting to brown. It's starting to brown. And we don't want it to burn, but it is starting to brown. And as it browns, I've let this cook now for about 5 minutes. So it's starting to brown. Don't let it burn though, but it's starting to brown. And in that browning, I'm going to be able to make my gravies out of this. And so this would be our brown roux. And this is great for making those pan sauces or sauces that are going to be making those sauces or whatever that are going to be darker in color. Again, like a good beef gravy, a good au jus, something like that. And I can already smell the nuttiness. It's nice and smoky, and once I pour in that stuff, it's gonna thicken. But again, because by the time it gets to this stage, there is less flour and less of a binder to work with that liquid, and so it will cause me to need more. Alright, and so one of the many misconceptions that I often see is when people are working with cornstarch, especially when they're trying to thicken something, especially like a soup or a sauce or something like that, a filling per se, like apple pie filling or something. It's important that whenever you're combining something like cornstarch or flour with a liquid, that whenever you're pouring that slurry into the item, that you use the appropriate temperature. The reason for that is if you pour a hot slurry into a cold soup, you run the risk of producing lumps, and vice versa. If you put a cold slurry into a hot soup or a hot dish, you will run the risk of getting lumps in that food. Now, you can use a slurry. You can absolutely use flour and water as a slurry. However, you're more likely to develop lumps using flour than you are with cornstarch because of the starch levels in flour that still make the flour somewhat of a presence and a thickener, and it doesn't often allow the flour to dissipate like it should, like cornstarch will. So that is one of the things that most people tend to make mistakes in whenever they're in the kitchen, is they try to thicken up things using the wrong temperature. If you have a hot soup or sauce or stock, always thicken it. If you need to thicken it with a hot slurry, that is cornstarch and hot water. If you are working with a cold soup, cold sauce, cold broth, make sure that it is thickened with the lightness of it, which would be a cold slurry, which is the mix of cornstarch and cold liquid. With that being said, today, I hope that you all enjoyed. I'm going to be doing this series more often because there are so many things that I think a home cook needs to know in order for them to be better equipped in their kitchens to cook creatively and spontaneously, and getting over simple little mistakes like knowing the difference between volume and weight and stuff like that can really benefit a person in the kitchen who might not have known that knowledge before. So I hope that you learned something new. I hope that you gained something out of this. And I hope that it helps you cook a little bit better when you go into your kitchen next time. And until the next time, I wish you all the best. God bless and happy cooking.